distinguished dignitaries on the dais, friends in the audience, it is a high privilege to initiate yet another conclave of our foundation, a foundation which is dedicated to one of the most important elements of nation building and indeed nationalism, which is ideas, and ideas that are relevant to their times. I have to begin with a tribute to Ram Madhav, who is really father, mother, and child. Of this very substantial and substantive effort. And it is really his vision, perspiration, and hard work that has made this conclave into a very important contribution to our intellectual discourse. The theme for this year's conference could not have been more appropriate or more apt. Leadership in the 21st century. The theme is not as simple as it looks, because to understand what a leader should be in the 21st century, you first have to understand what the 21st century is going to be like. And that itself should open minds to the potential of the age before us. Never forget that, 17, 18 years of the century are already gone. So the century is no longer a teenager. It is already on the cusp of becoming an adult. And what we do just now and today is now going to be the formative shape of the century in the coming years. And therefore, what is a useful and what is a practical point to begin? And it's a question which I have always found interesting. At what point does a century begin? A century doesn't begin with the calendar. This century didn't begin with 2000, the 20th century didn't begin with 1900, and the 18th century didn't begin with 1700 or 1800. If you look at the 19th century, then it is my view, because, after all, we have to look at events in terms of their impact upon the world, impact upon the region, and impact upon the world, and which are the decisive moments, which are the decisive events, which then shape the world and take it towards one particular cause. And in my view, the most important date and the most important turning point of the 19th century was 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo shifted the balance of power within the European nations, by which time the European nations had already emerged as the most important nations of the world and the decisive nations of the world. I will not elaborate on this, but leave you with just one fact which will illustrate what I am saying. After 1815, the number of ships that left Britain carrying with them trade, carrying with them goods, doubled. The number of ships to China and India. Trade is not a neutral fact. Even in the so-called open trade agreements, which have become very fashionable now, trade is never neutral. Trade is the sale and purchase, transfer of goods, and goods emerge out of something more. Goods emerge out of the knowledge edge. Goods emerge out of science, out of technology, about where a nation had gone by. But why was this? The doubling of the ships, which would then eventually go up to China and India, and take opium to China and actually implode Chinese strength almost imperceptibly. And why was it so important? Because till the 19th century, the greatest exporting nations of the world were India and China. Out of the 300 names for cloth, something like 280 come from India. And it was not just, of course, Bengal was the hub of cloth manufacture, but it was not just Bengal, I mean all over Gujarat. All of these states were thriving trading centers. And I'll again leave you with one statistic which will give you an indication. Indian cotton called calico and another product which was a combination of cotton and silk was the dominant fact of African markets. But within 1815 to 1840, the amount of British cloth which went into the African market displacing Indian multiplied by 25 times by 1850. And once that multiplication had taken place, the balance of power in terms of the wealth of nations had shifted irredeemably. Well, not irredeemably, because we are redeeming it now. But it took 150 years for the process to again, for our revival to again begin. This use of trade with gunboats became the operative mechanism for the rise of industrialization, for the rise of goods. And if you take a very simple statistic, I have always tried my best to quote the statistic as often as I can, because the more widely it is disseminated, the better it is. And this statistic is from Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Nations. Paul Kennedy teaches at Yale at this moment. In 1750, which is 7 years before Polashi, in 1750, India had 24% of world manufacture. 24%, one good out of every four was made in India. China had 30%, one good out of three. So between us, we had 50%. And that is why we were the superpowers of the age before that. By the time colonization wrecked us with both famine as well as the complete trade monopoly of the West, Britain had 24% by 1940 of world manufacturing output, and we had 2%. Britain in 1750 had 2%, but may I suggest, before we continue further, to blame the British for this is cowardice. It is not the British who won, it is we who lost. Let us accept that. And we lost because we had fallen behind in some very important ways, but most importantly, we had fallen behind in the knowledge fronting. Similarly, the next century, the 20th century, when did it begin? The 20th century, in my view, begins in 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Because the end of World War I completes a very, very unprecedented historical process. Oh, sorry, doesn't complete it, but takes it to a point where it cannot be reversed. And that is, it ends the age of empire. So, the empire, which was the geopolitical fact that sustained and created the geopolitics of the last 1,000 years, has now suddenly disappeared with the end of the Tsarist Empire, with the end of the Ottoman Empire, with the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course with the end of the German Empire. But the process had begun 100 years ago, which began with the Bolivares in Latin America, but most important, it was the Indian empires and the Chinese empires which began to crumble. However, the death of empires for me is actually good news. But what came in place of the empires is truly the first sign of modernity. Because what emerged out of the debris of empire in 1808 was the first time that we saw a new concept, a historic concept, which was the rise of the Republican nation state. And the term Republican is as important as nation state. Because they were republics shaped no longer by the will of dynasty, no longer by the will of sultans or maharajas or lords or kings or rulers. They were shaped basically by the will of the people. This process, which began in 1918-20 after the fall of the empires as they had to be reshaped, was taken to its logical course by Gandhiji. And actually there were four great rebellions or insurrections against British rule. One was, of course, in India, one was in Indonesia, one was in Egypt, and one was in Iraq, Mesopotamia. But the three weakened and went away. And I offer to you this thought. The reason why Gandhiji was able to take and capture the 20th century by ending colonization was because he found the answer to a worldwide question in Indian thought. The big question used to be, what and who can fight the British Empire? Common wisdom said the British Empire is going to last for 400 years. And Gandhiji did not fight the British Empire on the basis of Marxism or on the basis of any ism. He fought the British Empire on the basis of Indian thought and Indian philosophy, which was Satyagraha. And nobody recognized the power of Satyagraha, the power of truth, the power of justice in world affairs. These concepts were utterly alien to the politics of the time. But out of that emerged, now after the fall of colonization began in India and ended in India. After 1947, it could not be sustained anywhere in the world. But the idea that justice was going to be that Satya was going to be an important element of world affairs became the most important fact of the 20th century. That this was the first half of the 20th century. The second half of the 20th century, regrettably, was a little lost. Because in the beginning, we first had to fight the battles to defend our freedom. In India, of course, we had to fight them on many fronts against great mischief. Right? And the second, we had to give meaning to freedom. Freedom could not remain just a political project. Freedom had to become an economic project. If there was no freedom from poverty, if there was no freedom from hunger, then what was freedom all about? If there was no freedom from social injustice, particularly in gender, then what is freedom all about? So that process historically began, but sometimes went forward, sometimes went back. When did the 21st century start? The 21st century has two birthdays, both of them not very auspicious. One is 9/11, and the other is the terrorist attack on Bombay. These were the starting points which began to define the 21st century, because the 21st century is really going to be the century not of questions, but the century of answers. Because people are tired of waiting. And therefore, why is this so important? Because terrorism, we think please stop if there are any. We must never be naive. Terrorism is not just a law and order problem. Terrorism is not just a problem of somebody, introducing violence. Lots of elements of violence have been introduced. The two things that make terrorism or faith-based terrorism into an existential challenge, and I use the term advisedly, existential challenge. There are two reasons. One, because terrorism challenges the whole concept of the nation state. It does not believe in the nation state. So the Daesh does not actually believe why Iraq should be Iraq and why Syria should be Syria. I'm just giving you one example. I can multiply. The Boko Haram doesn't actually believe why they should be. What they believe in is faith-based space, not in the nation state. And this faith-based state then redevelops or reimagines itself into shibboleths and into shorthand terms like caliphate and so on and so forth, which are all actually post facto. And this challenge to nations and this challenge to nationalism is really the most dangerous fact. And that is why I have always argued that if you think that there is no intellectual answer to terrorism, that there is no ideological answer to terrorism, then you're wrong. The real ideological answer to terrorism is nationalism. And this is true everywhere. This is true everywhere. It is only the forces and the power of nationalism which will recognize the danger and push and drive and repel these elements away. The second danger of terrorism is that it threatens the most important element of modernity, the most not only of modernity, but of to any philosophy going back to the beginning of humanity. And that is the coexistence of all human beings as equals. The living together, plural societies, in which we all live together as one, irrespective of what our personal differences might be. Terrorists do not believe in a fundamental aspect of our Indian philosophy, Sarva Dharam Sambhav, which is essentially, in English, it would be described as faith equality. What they believe in is faith supremacy, the supremacy of one faith at the cost of another. That is unacceptable. Judgment on faith should be left to those who created faith. Leave judgment to God. In the meantime, as human beings, let's get on living together in a humanitarian way. And that is why our Prime Minister says over and over again that the basis of India's foreign policy is humanitarianism, is humanitarian. Recognize the human being. And how do terrorists destroy pluralism? Through the most vicious of weapons. That is not a gun, that is not a bomb. The most vicious weapon in human affairs is fear, my friends, fear. The moment you inject fear into society, you create invisible walls, you create distance, you create differences, you create imagined horrors. And therefore, the 21st century is going to be a struggle and to end this challenge of those who sell fear and those who sell or who challenge the nation state. But the most important element, and that is what the leadership of 21st century is going to be about, it is going to be the century where we search for prosperity. And not prosperity for the few, but prosperity for all. One of the most, I suppose, invidious theories that has affected governance, particularly in our worlds, is this theory sent to us from God knows which maven. That is the trickle-down theory. What is the trickle-down theory? Trickle-down theory means that those who have swimming pools will get waterfalls, and those who are dying of thirst will get a trickle. That is not sustainable. Not sustainable, forget it. The waterfall has to go to those dying of thirst. And they don't have time anymore. They've had given you enough time. They will. And that is why the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, made this the central point of his vision for the future. In his very first speech, I must remind you, those of you who have forgotten or it has slipped your memory, when he said, in his very first speech, and remember that poverty alleviation is a phrase from the Constitution. When he said, the age of poverty alleviation is over, and I could almost see the shock and horror on people's faces. And then he spoke of his true mission, that the era of poverty elimination has begun. And that poverty elimination will happen and is happening today on a scale that you do not realize. You do not realize that nearly $15 billion has gone into mudra. And for me, the giving of small loans without collateral, soft loans, is less important than the fact I'm going to tell you next, which is that 78% of these loans has gone to women. And this is the perfect marriage of gender emancipation, poverty elimination, and the absolutely radical use of mass technology, which no one in the world believes the scale on which it is happening in our country, of radical use of mass IT and mass technology in order to lift the last 100 million families in our country which are still at the bottom and take them and bring them up into the middle class, make the middle class more prosperous, right? And create a much greater degree of harmony. The 21st century leader must recognize that there is going to be no place for poverty. There is going to be no place for injustice, particularly gender injustice. Women are not going to wait, and why should they? They have, from time immemorial, they've suffered. This is going to be their century. Finally, I'll leave you with this thought. Human beings are land-centric. And this is probably the last important requirement of any leader. We are all land-centric. Everything we do is on land. We live on land. Our culture is land-oriented. Our agriculture is land-oriented. Our industry is on land. Everything is on land. But land is now a tired asset. Now land is a depleting asset. The 21st century will be controlled by seas, by skies, and space. And none of the three, seas, skies, space, have boundaries. And that will be the real challenge of how do we create a shared planet. And don't dismiss what I am saying as too visionary or too idealistic or too soft. This is the reality. It is a shared planet which is only going to say, because we live in an age of nation states. Nation states are sovereign states. There are no big states and no small states. We are all sovereign and equal. Yes, different nations have different capacities, but we are equal. And this is going to be the age of justice, of equality, and this is going to be the age, and only a leader with the vision of Swami Vivekananda, and I dare say the ability of Narendra Modi, understands what must happen. Thank you.